Now, I don't know about you guys, but I've been looking forward to this panel all day. It's a panel discussion about strategies and approaches that individuals can take, as well as organizations, to reduce the impact of imposter syndrome, one of my favorite topics. The moderator for this panel is the Senior Web Application Developer at TWG, a Deloitte business. She's also quite skilled and talented at knitting and sewing. Hey, please welcome Rowe, everyone. Let's get some claps in the chat.
Thank you. Thanks, Elise. Thanks everyone for having me here. I'm so excited to be here to talk to you about imposter syndrome, but not about it, about like combating it. As I was preparing for this panel, I was talking to some people. I mentioned that this was happening, and like every single one of them was like, oh, I have that. Oh yeah, that happens to me. Oh yeah, it's terrible. And like at some point, everybody's struggled with it. So it's kind of like an equalizer, if you will, in at least in the tech community for sure. And I think in a lot of careers and a lot of industries. And I was doing a little bit of research, and I mean, the numbers varied, but I think I saw something about like upwards of 80% of people have at some point in their lives felt like they are an imposter, like they have everybody fooled in their jobs. So like I certainly have, even as I was preparing for this panel, it was like my brain kept checking in with me being like, are you sure you're like even qualified to talk about imposter syndrome? Like maybe there's somebody who's going to be more of an imposter than you who could talk about this better. So I don't know. And I'm sure that a lot of people here, if you're joining this panel, you have as well, or if you haven't individually experienced it, I'm sure you've worked with somebody or crossed paths with somebody who has struggled with it. So today we're going to be having a little chat with three panelists, and we're going to be talking about, like Elise said, things that organizations and leaders can do to lessen the impact of imposter syndrome on the people that they work with, and just try to make things a little bit easier for the people who they work with. So I'm going to introduce our panelists now. We have three, like I said, three panelists joining us today. The first one is Natasha Seedy. Natasha is the operations and UX lead at Accelerate Her Future and the founder of FITCTO22. An advocate for gender and racial equity, she began her career as an educator and further pursued her advocacy work in the nonprofit, for-profit, tech, and social enterprise sectors. Her entrepreneurial spirit comes from her ancestors, drawing inspiration from her grandmothers to bring compassion, joy, and creativity in her leadership. At Accelerate Her Future, she is co-creating programs that center the voices of Black, Indigenous, and racialized women in business and STEM across Canada. As the founder of FITCTO22, she provides design expertise to values-aligned organizations that are making a social impact. Welcome, Natasha.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Next up, we have Chris Blackwood, a seasoned FITC presenter. Chris has been designing interfaces for over 20 years. Most of her career was spent in the Silicon Valley designing e-commerce experiences for companies ranging from startups to Fortune 500 corporations. She's both a researcher and a designer. And she's now designing the future of deep space operations for NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you.
And finally, we have Liam Thurston. Liam leads the user experience practice at Loblaw Digital, empowering Canada's largest retailer to ship products that help Canadians live life well. Prior to this, Liam helped build dozens of meaningful digital products with TWG and grow remarkable design and research teams in order to contribute to the positive impact of human-centered digital design in our beautiful world.
Thanks, Sam. Oh, you're not done. Sorry.
I was going to read the rest of it, but it's fine. I think we get the gist of it.
You get it. We used to work at the same company, you know.
All right. So thanks, everyone. Let's just like dive right into it, because I've got like 35 questions for you. So I hope we can get through them all. Just kidding, not that many. But if at any point during the presentation, anyone in the audience has any questions that they'd like to ask our panelists, feel free to drop them in the chat or in the like ask a question feature in Crowdcast, and we will get to that. I have a few questions, so we're going to do about 45 minutes of me grilling the panelists, and then we'll take about 15 minutes to ask any of the questions that come up during this. So where I want to start off is like an overwhelming majority of the discussions and the advice that I've seen on how to like deal with imposter syndrome and frame it as a way that puts a lot of the onus and a lot of the responsibility on the individual who is struggling with imposter syndrome. So a lot of it is like, this is what you need to do to fix this thing that's wrong with you. Like, you need to have more confidence. You need to like do your daily affirmations. Like, you need to change something about yourself. But my question for the panelists today is, why is it actually bigger than that? Why should leaders, managers, organizations care about the fact that the majority of people who come through their offices or their companies are going to experience imposter syndrome at one point? Why should they care? I'd like to, I didn't even think about who I was going to start with. Let's start with Natasha.
All right, great. Well, yeah, happy to get started. Thank you, Em, for that lovely introduction. And it's a pleasure for me to be joining you all today. Thank you for joining us in this very important conversation. I also want to start off by thanking Alicia Patel from TWG, as well as FITC for inviting me to be on this panel. Now, going back to your question, Em, I think the way that we've looked at imposter syndrome has been very problematic. The term itself that, we'll get into the terminology itself and why it's problematic, but the term itself implies that there's something wrong with the individual, but in fact, the term imposter syndrome is very much a systemic problem. It's not an individual problem. The system being, the workplace, educational institutions. As a racialized woman, I mean, this was never built for Black, Indigenous, and racialized people, particularly for women in those groups in mind. So it is no wonder that we don't feel like we belong in many of these places. So it's the workplace that needs the bias fixing. Imposter syndrome, or imposter thoughts, as I like to call it, happens when there's a feeling of exclusion, lack of belonging, feeling unsafe. And these are the many reasons as to why many women are, and especially Black, Indigenous, and racialized women, end up leaving and choosing the entrepreneurship route. So it is crucial that leaders, managers, and organizations create that inclusive and safe space.
That's fantastic. That's so true. Like, very true. Do any of the panelists want to comment on that next? Chris, do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, I'd love to add to that, because that was a really great way of answering the question. And I would add that in psychology, my background is in psychology. In psychology, the term for imposter syndrome is imposter phenomenon, because of that very thing, that syndrome indicates it might be something wrong with you. But in fact, I've only ever met 2 people in my life who didn't have imposter phenomenon, right? Everyone feels this way. And so there's a ton of research out there that says that people who are suffering from imposter syndrome, to use the common term, have much lower job satisfaction, even though they work harder and are generally better employees than people who don't have it. And this is because they're always trying to be better, and they're always trying to make people happy. And they're always trying to justify their right to be there. And so it's important, if we want to keep our good people, that we help them understand that they belong and that they're here for a reason, and they were hired because they have the skills. They don't have to earn their spot here. They already have it.
That's a great way to frame it. And Chris and Natasha, I mean, you put it so well. I think as a manager of teams, the way that I think about it, is that, when we're feeling these imposter phenomenon or imposter syndrome type feelings, it's usually a sign that either we feel unwelcome, we don't belong, or we're pushing up against some sort of growth that we're uncomfortable with. And so coaching a team through that feeling, or supporting them during that transition, trying to reframe that feeling as potentially being outside of your comfort zone, or being on the edge of growing into a new role, a new discipline, a new team, whatever it might be. Those are the moments where your role as a manager, a coach, a support for your team are like the stickiest. They form the tightest bonds. If you can coach someone through a difficult time like that and help them feel belonging, or help them grow into that next opportunity, those are the moments that you remember. I mean, look back in your career, we've all experienced them, right? The moments where we've gone from being, you know, a contributor to a manager, or switched from this trade into that trade, or moved from this job into that job. The folks who ushered that transition in for us and made us feel safe, trusted, and protected during it are the ones that we feel more loyalty for. And, you know, to put it bluntly, as a manager, you're looking for results and retention from your team. And this is a big retention hook. I hate to put it so crassly, but as a leader, you know, if you can form those conditions of retention through relationship building during sensitive times, it's a really effective way to win as a leader.
That's fantastic. I think, yeah, it's hard to think about it sometimes, like people are going to stay and they're going to save you money if they feel like they belong. Like, it's a hard way to phrase it, even though sometimes you need to put it like that so other people will like believe you when you say we need to change things, or we need to
exactly. This is why it matters. There's bottom line impact to retention to a business. So if you need to push up and say, hey, this is why we need these coaching frameworks or these developmental programs for these people, it does have bottom line impact.
So what can direct managers of teams, like if you're working directly with a team, what can you do to create an environment where everybody feels like they belong and where people don't feel like they're excluded in that? Chris? You look like you wanted to say something. Bouncing in your chair.
Yeah. So one of the things that we do is we have a practice called monkey stories, where we encourage people who are leaders to share stories of when they mess up. Every time I make a mistake, and it's probably daily, I share a monkey story. And this comes from the phrase, even monkeys fall out of trees. And by doing this, by sharing your own vulnerability as a leader, you make a safe environment for other people to do the same. And we celebrate the monkey stories instead of shaming people for them. So if one of my team members says, oh, I screwed up in this way, instead of being like, oh, you're a jerk, we all kind of laugh about it and we clap and we say, man, that was a good one. And I think that kind of, you don't have to be perfect all the time picture for a team really helps to combat the imposter syndrome, because often imposter syndrome comes from people being afraid of being judged and people feeling like they are being judged.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think it's up to the direct managers to prioritize creating that psychological safety. And the monkey stories, I mean, that's amazing, because you know, we're so accustomed to looking at a leader as being strong, has it all together all the time. But it's also important to show vulnerability, compassion, empathy, because those are very important leadership skills to foster a safe space of inclusion and belonging. I think also it's not just up to the managers, it's everybody on the team. It's everybody's responsibility on the team to create that safe space. And so everyone has bias. So start by becoming aware of your personal biases, and that goes for the managers as well as everybody else. And I think creating an environment of inclusion and belonging, it starts of a person's journey at the very beginning. So, you know, as a designer, I like to think of it as, you know, how is the person starting working at the company? So it starts at the recruitment process. And then there are many areas that we can look at when it comes to recruitment process and making it more inclusive. But for example, making language more inclusive in job postings. So moving away from terminology like rock star or champion, because studies have shown that tends to attract more male candidates than women. Other ways of, you know, creating that safe space is recognize and celebrate your team, and doing it very intentionally, and making sure that everyone is being acknowledged for their work. So it's also important to, you know, practice that active allyship in creating that safe space.
Yeah, great points. I echo the hearts, Chris. I mean, y'all nailed it. You know, leading by example, being authentic, sharing your own mistakes, and sunshining where you've learned yourself is key. And the only thing I'll add to that is understanding your own identity as and how it affects those narratives is really important, because as a as a cisgendered Caucasian man in a leadership position at my company, I think it's incumbent upon me and folks who look like me to overcorrect in that way. And so it is also authentic to me, but I really do go out of my way to share my mistakes, use language that is extremely inclusive, to acknowledge the fact that, well, most of the technology industry historically has looked like me, and it's part of my job to change that and to create a safe space for others. So the vulnerability piece for sure, sharing mistakes for sure, and almost more so because I'm the least likely to suffer from imposter syndrome if you look at the sort of the makeup of groups like ours in technology. And so I'd like to encourage others of similar identities to really make a stronger effort and overcorrect in these ways.
Yeah, that's really powerful, really important. I was going to ask another question. You kind of touched on it, but I was going to ask, so how does everybody here think that people with different intersection of identities are going to experience imposter syndrome differently? Like Liam, you said that you are the least likely to experience imposter syndrome, but do you still experience imposter syndrome? Do you think it looks different for you than for people who are on your team who have different identities than you?
I mean, yeah, I think I still experience it regularly, but it's more in who I interact with within our business context. So at Loblaw, it's a large organization, and I'm constantly interfacing with groups that don't have the same background as me, or are expecting a different story or a different acumen around sort of business logic or financial structures. And I don't know those things, and so I get terrified in those environments, and I have to work really hard to. I feel like a total imposter, and so I do that by engaging sort of coaches who are SMEs in those spaces and having them level me up. But again, it's not, I can't own the narrative of feeling like an imposter, because as I entered the technology industry 20 years ago, it looked very much like me, and it felt very comfortable for me to grow up in it. And so now I'm looking around me and seeing the problems in that and how we need to overcorrect to change it.
That's really true. Chris, what do you think about the teams that you have? Do people who are on your teams experience it differently?
Yeah, I mean, every person is unique, and every person is going to bring their own history and their own baggage to every role, right? And I say baggage like it's a bad thing, but it isn't. We all have baggage, everyone over the age of 4. And I think when you have intersectionalities, that it complicates the imposter syndrome. It doesn't necessarily change whether you experience it, because I've known plenty of cisgendered white men who felt like they weren't good enough, especially here at NASA. You see it all the time. And I think the more intersectionality somebody has on top of them, single mother, Black woman, no college degree, regardless of whatever it is that they carry or feel is an identity that threatens them with regard to their peers, it's going to make things harder for them. And it's going to make the unpacking of how they feel harder. And I think the only thing you can do is you can just support people unconditionally. I think a manager has to have unconditional positive regard for their people. That's another psychology term, but really it means no matter what your people do, you care for them and you support them and you've got their back. And maybe you're helping them grow through things, or maybe you are helping them address things that cause them upset. But in the end, sometimes you're just helping people embrace who they are.
That's so good. It's like you're managing the person, like the whole person, not just like the output that they've given to you 3 days in a row, like doing a really good job. It's like they have way more to them, and there's way more going on there than just the good things or just the wins, I guess. Natasha, did you have anything else you wanted to add to that?
Yeah. So Ruchika Choshan wrote an HBR article on imposter syndrome. And, in that article, she says that women of color experience imposter syndrome thoughts or doubts more severely because of its results of systemic racism and bias. And studies show that for white men, as they progress in their careers, they're able to find role models and coaches, as Liam noted, and their work is usually validated over time. But if we look at women, and particularly those from systemically excluded populations, there are less role models the higher they go, and they have lesser access to coaching, sponsors, and mentors. And all throughout, Black, Indigenous, and racialized women, they tend to face microaggressions almost on a daily basis. So everybody's experiences are different, but the lack of access to coaches and mentors and networks, it makes the imposter thoughts even more severe. When I entered the tech field, I became more hyper aware of my race and gender, and to some extent my faith. Attending meetings day after day and seeing meetings and workplace joined by mostly white men, frankly speaking, and facing microaggressions at different levels, even at an institutional level. For example, just walking around the workplace where all the meeting room names were named after white men. So when you experience that as a racialized woman, you don't feel a sense of belonging just on that level itself. And that can be quite taxing. And the long-term effects of it can be quite detrimental to health. So, these microaggressions, they add up over time, which create these imposter thoughts and feelings like we don't belong. Things are slowly starting to change. There's more awareness, but I think we need to move faster.
Move faster, like we have to take action.
We have to take more
right
action.
Away.
Yes, exactly. And not just practice, allyship, but practice active allyship.
Can you say a little bit more about that? What do you mean by active allyship, so we all have some tips about that?
That's a great question. Yes. So in a study done by McKinsey on women in the workplace, while 77% of white identifying employees say that they're allies to women of color, only 10% have shown allyship behavior. So the important thing to note here is that there is awareness, there is an intention of being allies, but people aren't really sure how to practice that active allyship. So some examples can include, advocating for new opportunities for racialized and Indigenous women, actively confronting discrimination. So if you see someone repeating a woman's ideas in a meeting or interrupting them, please practice active allyship by confronting that behavior, publicly acknowledging racialized women for their ideas and work, understanding your own bias. These are just some of the very few examples of what you can do as an active ally.
Those are great examples, Natasha. If I could just add to a couple of things there. One of the strongest levers we have to use in creating a diverse and inclusive society and teams that we work in is hiring, the hiring process. And regardless if you're a hiring manager or not, the hiring process, especially as we try to correct for diversity in our industry and encourage more of it, should be open sourced by whatever HR team you're supported by. And if you want to influence it, it should be, or I would advise that's our point of influence to bring more folks that are of more diverse backgrounds into our teams. And so encouraging, asking to see, candidate pools, asking what the ratio is for different identities within those candidate pools. What are your standards around that? I mean, luckily in technology, we've been working on this for a while, and I think it's a priority for many businesses like ours, but there's still more we could do. And so referring folks in, encouraging, making sure that interview panels reflect the identity of the interviewees, things like that. There's so much that we can do with the hiring process. And that's where, as a manager, I choose to apply most of my, or not most of my, but some of my allyship is in controlling the hiring process in a way that ensures that the team, I'm just trying to get myself out of the way, right? The team should not look like me going forwards. And so, I try to make sure that the hiring process reflects that.
I think that's super important. I mean, for me as an engineer, when I'm going into, nothing triggers my imposter syndrome more than pair programming live on the spot, this thing that I do not know how to do. And it's well, I'm in the wrong job. I clearly don't know how to do any of this stuff, which is not true, but that type of, okay, let me just do my plug for redoing how we do technical interviews for engineers. Just kidding. But
yes, please.
It's so true. It's it's really, really, really hard. And then once you get in there, you're well, if you already thought that you like maybe tricked the interviewers because you didn't really know what you were doing, then I feel like that doesn't really set you up for having a very good connection to the work that you're doing after you get hired or after you join the group.
Absolutely.
So, okay, let's pivot a little bit to something a little bit more positive maybe. So in your past, like when you were experiencing imposter syndrome in the past, what is something that a leader has done for you that was really, really, really impactful and that really helped to help you grow or help you see that maybe you do deserve to be here and you aren't as much of an imposter as you thought you were 30 seconds ago? Chris?
Yeah. So I, at my last company, had the most amazing manager. And I was in a new industry. I was dealing with entirely new stuff. And I felt very lost and I felt very insecure. And I was always asking her, how can I be better? What can I do better? You know, it's that whole, you know, compensate for the imposter syndrome through continuous improvement. And she actually gave me a fantastic book called The Strengths Finder. And she encouraged me to focus on my strengths and focus on the unique things that I bring to the company rather than focusing on being the same as everyone else in the company. And that was immensely helpful. And as a matter of fact, I have now used that same technique for my people because it did so much good for me to think about the fact that I'm a unique individual who brings unique contributions. And just because my contributions aren't exactly the same as theirs doesn't mean they aren't valid.
I love that. And I think that that's super important. And I have a follow-up question to that, which is, so we both agree that that is important and that everybody's strengths are different. How do you help maybe like executives or like stakeholders or people higher up see that this person is doing a lot of the, maybe like the emotional labor, or a lot of the, like they're really good at facilitating meetings, or they're really good at seeing things from a different perspective, but they maybe aren't, okay, maybe irrelevant for you, they aren't pushing the most lines of code, they aren't opening the most PRs, they aren't designing the most designs. How do you help leadership to see that these contributions are really valuable and need to be recognized and recognized in the same way, or like given equal weight to other types of work?
Well, when I'm talking about my people, I talk almost exclusively in terms of their strengths. So when I'm talking about putting somebody on a project, I'll say, here's this person, their strengths are this, this, and this. They're really great at this. They're the best person at that. And I will couch the entire engagement in those strengths. And then if the person, if the stakeholder or the executive is asking for that person to do something outside their skill set, or maybe asking them to work faster or whatever, I will have a conversation with that leader and I will talk about why. And I will talk about, you know, you almost treat it like a UX project at that point. You do the 5 whys to dig into the root cause of what they're really trying to get out of this person. And then either you put another person on the project because this person doesn't have the skill set that's needed, or you add a person to the project to supplement, or you coach the person to gain that new skill. You know, the solution is always different, but as long as you are always couching things in your people's strengths, and you're always kind of digging into why somebody wants something other than that strength, then I think you have a much better chance of succeeding.
Honestly, I think that that's such great advice, and I want to apply that for myself as well, because it's so easy to remember the like 3 mistakes that you made 4 months ago than it is to remember the like 12 really great things that you did like just last week or something. So I think that helping the leaders to think about things in terms of strengths is really powerful advice. I really like that.
Totally. I wanted to pick up on the thread of, you know, how a leader has impacted or coached you through an imposter syndrome moment. And something I think is really helpful that I heard about a dozen years ago from a great mentor of mine at TWG, actually, Andreas. He coached me to understand that, it's not our job to have all the answers. So if you're in a room that doesn't look like you or feels uncomfortable, or you're, intimidated for some reason to be there. And as a consultant, you feel that all the time, building software for businesses where you have no idea how they work or what their value offering is, and you're just trying to learn. And our job in rooms like that, or our job in teams where we're joining or feeling new or perhaps like an imposter, isn't to have all the answers and isn't to fit in right away. It's to have the tools to learn, and to understand how to ask good questions. And so to Chris's point a moment ago about the 5 whys, learning to ask good questions and be a great active listener is an incredible way to combat imposter syndrome, at least in my experience. And knowing that you don't have to have the answer and being comfortable just asking questions will actually demonstrate your authority to be vulnerable and to be curious within a room is a really impressive trait that ends up making you feel more part of a group and for others to perceive you as part of the group if you really care about the answer.
That's fantastic. Natasha, did you have anything you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I mean, in the past, where I've had imposter thoughts or imposter moments, I didn't really quite feel safe to bring it up with the leaders and the management in my team, mainly because, because of the microaggressions and the gaslighting that I have faced as a racialized woman. And also, I didn't recognize that as a systemic problem. I thought of, this to be a personal problem. But in my current role at Accelerate Her Future, Dr. Golnaz Golnaragi, who's the founder, and the team have done a wonderful job of creating a psychological safe space. So when those moments do come up, it's really helpful to have that reciprocal mentorship in place. When the leader is already vulnerable and opens up first, as Liam and Chris both mentioned before, that vulnerability is key. It is so important to feel safe enough to bring up, the fact that, hey, I'm going through this. I'm having these thoughts. It's so valuable to have a leader creating that space for me to talk through it. And as both of them mentioned, highlighting my strengths and celebrating my achievements. I think that is something that my current leader is doing that's been super helpful.
That's great. That's so good. I'm wondering what it looks like from the outside. So I think we talked about like how you can create this safe space or this inclusive space or a sense of psychological safety within a team. If you are somebody who is maybe managing people who manage teams, like you don't have your own team, but you have a lot of eyes on a lot of different areas. What are some key tells that you're looking for like this team is thriving? The people here are probably in a pretty good space psychologically. And what are some things that you look for that's a flag, like we need to address this. This team might need a little bit more attention or a little bit more help.
I think just walking into a meeting room and just, recognize and seeing who is doing most of the talking, taking most of the, and also who is being more recognized and who is being less recognized for their work and their achievements. I think that will give you those red flags as to, hey, this isn't quite a safe space for everyone. It feels like it's more beneficial to certain people, but not to all. Some green flags, though, if you walk into a meeting and people are openly, providing feedback to the management, actively participating, both in the meetings and also providing, their ideas outside of the meeting, that will give you a good sense of it looks like there's safety in place. Whereas, with the other example, it's like, maybe, we need to look at it and work at it.
Very cool.
I've noticed.
Chris?
Yeah. Sorry, I was just gonna jump in.
Yeah, do it.
I've noticed too that when you see crosstalk and relationships in teams, that tends to mean that team is feeling good. If you walk by their area and they're chattering with each other while they work, if they're collaborating together without being told to, And those are all green flags for me. And then I see that sometimes you'll see teams that start making lots of excuses. They start delivering things late. They will not show you work until it's perfect. That is a red flag. That is a sign that there is not the right level of support there and that people don't feel safe. And maybe that's imposter syndrome rearing its ugly head, or maybe it's something else, but it's a place where you start looking and you start talking to people. And then I've noticed also that in a really healthy team, people feel comfortable coming to their manager for help as a mentor, rather than as a person who is disciplining them. And when you see people coming, skipping a level to have a conversation or talking to other managers, but not talking to their own, that's a huge sign that there is not a safe space there.
Yeah, nice one, Chris. That's yeah, I'm in a large and complex team. So that one rings true. When you find communication is traveling around certain folks, it's a big red flag for sure. I wanted to boil it down to something that's really interesting in our mostly remote world now, or hybrid world, because a lot of our interaction happens in Slack or some sort of communication platform. And so the thing I watch for is working in the open. And we've also captured it in like the real world in our comments, but essentially, project channels or team channels should be a safe enough space for folks to, share what they're working on, get feedback, et cetera, et cetera. And I measure it simply by when you start a channel and it's about a project or a team or whatever it might be, how many sort of side threads pop up within the first couple of weeks of sharing. If it's if everybody's in this channel, we're all working on this thing towards this common goal, why are these three people spinning off a side chat to talk about something that they're not comfortable sharing on the channel? And there are reasons for that. There are myriad reasons, and sometimes they're totally fine. But I do love the idea of creating in the open, designing in the open, and benefiting from the perspective of everybody. That's why we build diverse teams, because diverse perspectives create better experiences. And so, the fact that folks need to shelter their work in a way is a sign of some sort of lack of health within a team. Also, the abundance of heart emojis in a channel, if we could just quantify that, I think that's generally a measure of
and
overall.
gifts.
Yeah, and gifts, exactly. The playful nature of your Slack channels is probably a good indicator. In prepping for this talk, I actually started a thread on imposter syndrome a couple of weeks ago in our UX channel, and I was so overwhelmed by the amount of vulnerability, the stories that were shared that were just so heartfelt and vulnerable and honest. And it was a really positive highlight for me about the culture that we're creating that, folks feel comfortable to share.
That's fantastic. Yeah, making sure that you have a lot of custom emojis to represent every feeling that you have, and then using them very liberally, very liberally.
Always.
Okay, this is all such good intel, and I know that it's about imposter syndrome, but it also a little bit pivoted into healthy teams and team dynamics and feeling safe. And I think that all wraps up into places where you would have the least amount of imposter syndrome, or maybe you have a little bit of it, but it's certainly not exacerbated by the environment that you find yourself in. But if individually, if we're speaking about this, I think Chris touched on this in the beginning of the discussion, where he said that people with imposter syndrome are going to be maybe generally better employees. What do you think are the benefits for an individual of having imposter syndrome? Are there any strengths? Is there any way to take the imposter that you're feeling and pivot it into a positive?
So I would say that seeing imposter thoughts as beneficial and strength is a survival response. As a racialized woman, I've had moments of imposter thoughts, and those have been as a result of microaggressions, sexism, racism that I've faced in the workplace. So rather than embracing those imposter thoughts, I've gained more awareness as to why those thoughts are coming up for me. And instead, as Chris mentioned, choosing to embrace my strengths instead, and finding strategies to disrupting those messages that are coming at me and that we're receiving, and to celebrate myself. That's how I look at it.
Okay. I like that.
I feel that definitely. And I have come to the conclusion that with myself, a lot of my imposter thoughts, which I love that phrase, and I'm totally stealing it. I think a lot of my imposter thoughts come from inside me rather than from outside me.
Mhm.
And one of the things that I've tried to do is recognize that that means that I'm always looking for an opportunity to grow and embrace that as a strength. I will always be improving because that's probably the adaptive measure of that imposter thought. And I also embrace it as an opportunity to get more collaboration. If I feel insecure about something, I'm going to share it with lots of people early and often and collaborate with them and make it a group effort and get that amazing diversity of perspectives in there that isn't just in my head. And so that's where I take it because for whatever reason, I do think a lot of my imposterness comes from inside me rather than from other people treating me poorly.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And an incredible leader on my team named Eiko Kawano framed this as the imposter monster. And if you can like name it and look at it and take it outside of you and look at the monster, then you can acknowledge it as either fear or love or growth or whatever you need it to be. When you can, you know, individualize it, maybe you can sort of face it or deal with it a little bit more productively.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a luxury and a privilege to recognize that it's like you're your only blocker versus what Natasha was saying, where actually it's because of all of these other external factors. So like everything has a little bit, like we got to take a little bit from column A and a little bit from column B, and some people are going to take more from column B and some people are going to take more from column A. So it's nice to be able to think of ways that you can pivot it to make it work for you, and important to remember that not everybody is going to be able to do that because not everybody is coming from, it's not always coming from inside the house.
Very true.
Very true.
So we have a couple of questions that have come in our Q&A. So I want to get to some of those, but in case that I don't get to come back with one of my own thoughts, I want to ask one final rapid fire question, which is that if you could pass on like one tiny little nugget of wisdom to somebody who is like right now, currently, today, during this panel, after this panel, being like absolutely swallowed by their own imposter syndrome, like what would you say to help them get out of it enough to be able to take action?
I can get us started. So first of all, take a moment to celebrate yourself. And when I say celebrate yourself, write down your accomplishments from the past couple of weeks. And what will happen is you will start seeing facts about yourself rather than feelings. And there might be a tendency of, comparing yourself to someone else, but keep shining that light on your own talents, on your own strengths. It does take time. So, choose to have a journal, and also note down your imposter thoughts day to day, becoming more aware of it so you don't start identifying with it, so that you create that spaciousness between yourself and that imposter monster. Practice presence. As Eckhart, I'm a huge follower of Eckhart Tolle, focusing in on the moment and becoming aware of those thoughts as they come up. And for the managers and leaders, take the time to celebrate the accomplishments of your team, particularly of those who are, racialized and Indigenous women in the workplace, and becoming, and recognizing for all the work and their contributions.
I'd love to follow that with a much shorter, but maybe related comment, which is that if I could only tell people one thing, it would be that the person you're comparing yourself to, or a person you think belongs where you are, whereas you don't, there's a better than 90% chance that they also feel like they don't belong. And so just remember that. Maybe have a little extra compassion for them because you actually understand how they feel.
That's a great one. The one thing I try to impart on everybody, and it may not feel like this all the time, but everyone is here to see you succeed. The community you're in, the world you're joining, the group, the team, the company you're at wants to see you win. We're not here to, folks aren't here to put you down. At least that's what I choose to believe, and that's the world that I want to create.
Fantastic. I think those are all really like heartwarming, not to diminish it, but like kind of heartwarming things to remember. And I really like that. So we've had a couple of questions come in the Q&A box. So if anybody any of our viewers at home have questions, you can type them into the Q&A, or you can also upvote questions to bring them to the top of the list to say that you desperately need them to be answered by the panelists. So the first question is from Morgan, and Morgan wants to know, I want to be an active ally and call people out/in for behaviors that I and other women don't appreciate, but I freeze up because I don't want to be labeled as difficult. How do you approach these feelings, either by getting over it or avoiding it, or how do you approach these feelings? Natasha.
So first of all, that's a really good question. Freezing response, it's quite common. Your safety is first and foremost the most important. So only, it's great that it's coming up for you. That means that you've recognized that there's something wrong. There's an injustice taking place. So practice safety first. Note down the scenario that has taken place, the discrimination that has taken place, and document it, and talk to your coworkers who you feel safe with. And that way there's a dialogue happening and you've documented what has happened, so that when you go into that conversation and speak to your management or whoever has done this, there are facts that you can take with you. And so, you feel more ready and more prepared. But again, take the time to breathe and feel safe first. It's the most important thing. But great to hear that there is active allyship taking place.
I think that was such an amazing answer. Can I tag one additional thing on the end of it?
Of course.
That is that one of the things that we've coached people to do here, because we started out in a very male-dominated field, aerospace, is rather than if you're not comfortable just being the difficult woman, speak up and compliment people who are doing active allyship. So one of the things you can do to call people out is to call other people in. And it helps because then you're the nice guy, but you're pointing out desired behavior and you're reinforcing it.
I really like that. I think that's huge. Both of those really great answers. Thank you. I do have a question for Liam, kind of related to that, which is, so among the four of us, maybe, I'm not saying that you are, but potentially you might be the one who would think oh, this person's just being difficult, they're blowing it out of proportion or something, potentially, in theory.
Sure.
What do you say to people when they come to you with these complaints, and how do you validate them, and how do you let them know that you're listening to them and hearing them and want to take action on these, assuming that you do want to do these things? Well, I know you do. So
I do. I was worried I was going to have to play a role there, that it's not authentic to me. I get feedback like this all the time, and I embrace it, and I'm so thankful for it. And I try to change my behaviors and the way we lead our teams from it. And the first thing I do is demonstrate gratitude. Feedback is hard to give, especially of this nature, and I'm so appreciative when it's given. And so I will take a moment and I would never respond immediately, right? Just listen, provide space, say thank you, choose the format in which you receive the feedback. If the person indicates to have feedback for you, tell them that you're willing to receive it in person, in writing, over a call, whatever is the most comfortable avenue for them, and then just show immense gratitude for the feedback, spend time with it, and then create a thoughtful response. I think it's incumbent on every leader to do that. that's how I choose to respond usually.
That's great. And I think that it's like, we all know that like everybody talks. Like if you give feedback to somebody and they dismiss it, other people who work there are going to find out. But I think also equally, like if you are open to feedback that somebody gives you, then they're going to tell people and they're going to be like, oh yeah, I told him when this thing happened and he was so great about it and it was really great. And you should feel comfortable going to talk to this person about it as well.
That actually reminds me too, is make space for that feedback regularly in every one-on-one, weekly within my teams. I'm like, I'm always open to feedback. Please, here's a form, here's a channel, here's a something, like choose the avenue, give me feedback, creating the conditions where you signal that you're open to it is important too.
That's great. Another question that came in is from Jennifer, and she would like to know, or they would like to know, directed at Chris, but I think we'll let other people answer it as well. But do you think that strengths need to be things that you're good at, or how do you create a balance between doing things that you're good at and the things that you want to be doing, or the things that you desire to be good at in the future?
I think a strength can be a developing skill. Strength and skill are not the same thing. Strength might be the place. I'm sorry, what was that?
What's the difference between a strength and a skill?
Yeah, I would say a strength is something that you are passionate about and something that you have some knowledge and talent in. And a skill is something that you can do. So, I have some skills that are not my strengths. I am a programmer, but that is not my strength. I'm not the best. So I think I would encourage people, if there is something you're passionate about, if there's something you're drawn to, turn it into a strength by developing an interest in it, by learning about it, by adopting it and talking about it and sharing it with other people. And then before you long, you will be the expert in that thing as far as everybody's concerned. Just kind of happens organically.
I love that. Be like really loud about the things that you like to do and are passionate about, and then people are going to know that that's what you like to do and what you're good at it. Your personal brand or your professional brand, your personal professional brand. I'm not sure, depending on how you look at it. That's fantastic. We had another question from Asaf who wants to know, I don't know if I keep prefacing it with like, wants to know this, when the question isn't phrased, that would follow from that. Anyway, Natasha noted that oppressive power structures relate directly to how imposter syndrome works on individuals. Since a big example is the toxic ways that men, or especially white men, deal with their own anxieties, it seems like open vulnerability is one of the best tools we have for combating the destructive systemic effects of imposter syndrome. How can we encourage and enact vulnerability in positive, constructive ways in workplaces and professional communities where people are potentially resistant to that?
Gosh. If I can follow that anecdote that I shared a minute ago about the vulnerability and imposter syndrome thread in Slack, when I reflected on that and I looked back in that channel, it was days of conversation, many stories told, and all of the folks sharing were female identifying. And then a bunch of male identifying people came directly to me in DMs and shared me their stories. And it really made me zoom out and reflect on, wow, sure, we have a culture of vulnerability, but it's disparate across different identities. And what am I to do about that? How do we work on this together? And so I think in that instance, for me, it was a huge light bulb moment, a huge learning, and frankly confounding, other than dealing with individuals directly and asking why is that vulnerability something you're uncomfortable sharing in a public channel, just out of curiosity. And that's the path that I'm on right now, but it was a big light bulb. So I don't have the answer, but that's an experience that really rocked me recently.
I remember when I started at NASA, showing some like rough sketch work in progress stuff and having a systems engineer come up to me and tell me that he wanted me to be successful here. And if I was going to be successful here, I shouldn't do that. I should only show finished work. And I realized at that point that at least in that group, which I was working with, they had a very non-vulnerable culture. And so what I did was I doubled down because I knew they couldn't fire me. They were a partner of mine, right? They're not my boss. And I doubled down and I explained myself and explained why I was doing it and that this was part of the process. And I will say it took about 2 years, but the culture of that group changed because I was the first one to be vulnerable, and then it showed others they could be. And I am fortunate that I was in a safe space. Like I said, they couldn't fire me. There are other times when you're in a place where if you did that, they'd flip the bozo switch and you'd get fired. And in that case, maybe that's not a place you want to be in. Maybe you should be looking for a better environment anyways.
Leading by example, so powerful.
Yeah,
So
and I
powerful.
would say, I think it's time that we start celebrating leadership like that. There are so many different types of leadership styles out there. And I think we need to start looking at, what does it mean to be a leader? And like I said, vulnerability is one of them. And so I think, first of all, changing a personal bias, understanding those biases, and at the same time, celebrating those different leadership styles is very important.
Liam, I'm so it's interesting and yet also not at all surprising that thread was full of women sharing these feelings, and then the men were doing that, signaling that to you in private. How do you think that you're going to change it so the next time you ask a question like that or a question similar, that more of them are going to feel able to share that in public?
Yeah, good question. Well, first of all, I wasn't the one who noticed it. I had that called out to me by a female leader on the team.
Okay.
And so that's one blind spot that I had. I was like, oh, we're all just people sharing stories. This is, normal. And I didn't actually realize that was the fact. And then the second piece is, I think, again, working with folks individually to gauge their comfort, but to call people into those conversations. We're lucky to have a very honest and vulnerable culture. So I think those individuals would be comfortable sharing. And so I'm sort of on that journey of inviting folks into conversations privately first, and then, in a group setting. That's the best I've got right now. But it's a work in progress, and I think we're doing the right thing.
I'd like to point out that Liam just led by example by pointing out that he had a blind spot and by trying to address it. And true. I think that's freaking amazing.
We love that.
I make mistakes all the damn time. Trust me. I love it.
That's
Thanks
great.
for acknowledging that, Chris.
Thank you all for sharing these strategies and approaches and things about yourselves and about your teams. And I have had a very nice time chatting with all of you. Thanks for sharing and for being so thoughtful and coming so prepared, and for being the panelist of my first time moderating a panel.
You did
I will
great,
think about
Emma.
you in the future.
Thank you so much.
I think that's all the time that we have for today. So thanks everyone thanks for tuning in, and thanks for having us.
Thanks, folks.
Thank
Enjoy the rest of
you.
the conference.
Great job, Em, for your first time hosting this. Thank you for all the panelists. I got all the feels during. I just was like, I wanted to talk. I'm like, I want to say something too. I feel like everyone in the chat wanted to be really active in this. Just all the feels. I'm like, I just want to work with all of you. Can we be a company together? So just thank you so much for sharing all of your stories, your feedback, and just helping improve workspaces, hopefully with all the people that are joining us today. Hopefully we're all inspired.